Welcome to the back room. Relax, unwind, and let our soothing gangster bedtime stories guide you into calm and peaceful sleep. Here we tell the quieter side of history, the childhoods, ambitions, and lives of legendary gangsters, without focusing on violence. As you settle in, share with us in the comments where you're listening from, what time it is right now, and one good thing that's happened to you today. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy our stories, please like this video to support the channel and subscribe so you never miss a new upload. Your encouragement helps us bring more Mafia bedtime stories to life. Now close your eyes, feel at ease, and enjoy tonight's story. Wishing you peace and the sweetest dreams.
Listen closely. The sound of history changing is rarely a shout. It is not the roar of a cannon or the wail of a siren. More often, it is a small, insignificant sound, a ticking engine cooling in the winter air, the scratch of a match against a box, the soft exhalation of smoke. It is March 21, 1980. The night is cold in South Philadelphia, a damp chill that seeps through the brick of the row homes and settles in the marrow of the bones. On Snyder Avenue, the streetlights cast long, amber pools of light onto the asphalt, illuminating the quiet domesticity of a working-class neighborhood. Curtains are drawn. Televisions flicker blue in living rooms. The city is asleep, or pretending to be. Parked at the curb is a dark sedan. Inside, the world is small, enclosed, and intimate. The heater has been turned off, but the warmth of the engine still lingers, battling the encroaching frost. In the passenger seat sits an old man. He is 69 years old, wrapped in a heavy overcoat, his fedora resting on his knee. His name is Angelo Bruno. To the people who live on this block, he is just a neighbor, a quiet man who tips well at the barbershop, who buys his bread from the local bakery, who nods politely as he walks to Mass on Sundays. But in the ledgers of the FBI and the whispered conversations of social clubs from New York to Sicily, he is something else entirely. He is the Don, the boss, the architect of a criminal empire that stretches from the docks of the Delaware River to the casinos of Atlantic City. Yet look at him now. There is no tension in his shoulders, no paranoia in his eyes. He sits relaxed, his hands folded in his lap, chatting quietly with his driver, John Stanfa. The conversation is banal, perhaps about the weather, or the meal they just shared, or the price of gasoline. It is the small talk of men who believe they have all the time in the world. The interior of the car smells of stale cigar smoke, old leather, and the faint, sweet scent of cologne. It is a masculine smell, a comforting smell. Outside, a train whistles in the distance, a lonely, mournful sound that emphasizes the silence of the street. Angelo Bruno is known as the Gentle Don. It is a nickname that carries a heavy irony, but also a kernel of truth. For 20 years, he has ruled Philadelphia not with the iron fist of a tyrant, but with the steady hand of a diplomat. He believes in order. He believes in rules. He believes that violence is a failure of negotiation, a messy, unnecessary extravagance that is bad for business. He has built a world where disputes are settled with envelopes of cash, not bullets, where territories are divided by handshakes, not turf wars. He is a man from an older time, a relic of a generation that valued silence above all else. He believes that if you treat people with respect, if you share the wealth, if you keep your head down, you will be safe. He believes his rules protect him. He is wrong. As he sits there, bathed in the amber glow of the streetlight, he is unaware that the world has changed around him. The code he lives by, the code of honor, of loyalty, of omerta, has eroded. It has been replaced by a new, sharper hunger. The men who wait in the shadows do not care about diplomacy. They do not care about respect. They care only about the crown he wears, and they are willing to break every rule to take it. The packing of this moment is hypnotic. Time seems to stretch, elongating these final seconds of peace. We are trapped in the amber with him, suspended in the calm before the storm. We want to warn him. We want to tell him to lock the door, to drive away, to look out the window. But we are ghosts in this story, observers of a tragedy that has already been written. Stanfa says something and Bruno turns his head slightly to listen. A faint smile touches his lips. He looks like a grandfather telling a story to a younger relative. He looks entirely, fatally human. And then the rupture. It does not begin with a scream. It begins with a movement in the darkness outside the passenger window, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows of the street, a figure stepping into the pool of light. The sound that follows is not a bang. It is a tear in the fabric of reality. The boom of a shotgun at close range is a physical blow, a concussive wave that shatters the glass and the silence in the same instant. The window explodes inward in a spray of diamonds. The piece of the car interior is obliterated. The smell of cigar smoke is instantly replaced by the sharp, acrid stench of cordite. Angelo Bruno does not have time to be afraid. He does not have time to understand. One moment, he is a king sitting in his carriage. The next, he is a memory. The blast hits him behind the right ear, a sudden, violent erasure of the man who held the city together. He slumps forward, his body heavy, the life leaving him before the echo of the shot has even faded from the brick walls of the row homes. Silence rushes back in, but it is a different kind of silence now. It is heavy, shocked, ringing. The engine continues to tick as it cools. The streetlights continue to hum, but the world has fundamentally shifted. The gentle dawn is dead. The era of the handshake is over. And as the blood begins to pool on the leather seat, dark and thick in the dim light, the demons of the underworld, held in check for so long by the sheer force of Bruno's will, begin to stir. The gates are open. The dogs of war have been let loose on the streets of Philadelphia. And Snyder Avenue, once just a quiet street in a quiet neighborhood, becomes the epicenter of a storm that will tear the city apart for the next decade. To understand the end, we must first understand the beginning. We must leave the cold, blood-stained interior of the sedan on Snyder Avenue and travel back in time, to a world that smells of oregano, sawdust, and hope. We must go to the Italian market in South Philadelphia in the early years of the 20th century. It is a world of sensory overload. The narrow streets are a canyon of noise and color. Pushcarts are piled high with bright red tomatoes, purple eggplants, and emerald peppers. Vendors shout their prices in a dozen different dialects of Italian, Sicilian, Calabrian, Neapolitan, their voices creating a chaotic symphony of commerce. The air is thick, almost chewable, layered with the scent of curing meats hanging in butcher windows, the sharp tang of sharp provolone, and the yeasty warmth of bread baking in coal-fired ovens. This is the ecosystem that forged Angelo Anellaro. He was not born into royalty. He was born into the struggle of the immigrant experience, arriving from Sicily as a child. His name, a heavy vowel-laden suitcase that he would eventually trade for the simpler, sturdier Bruno. But unlike many of his contemporaries, who looked at the poverty around them and saw a reason to pick up a gun, Angelo looked at the market and saw a classroom. He was a quiet boy, watchful. While other children ran wild in the alleys playing stickball and getting into fistfights, Angelo was working. He swept floors, he stocked shelves, he listened. He learned early on that the market ran on more than just money. It ran on relationships. It ran on favors. It ran on trust. If Mrs. Rossi couldn't pay for her groceries this week, you let her slide because you knew her husband would get paid on Friday, and their loyalty would be worth more than the few cents of interest. He learned that a man who is respected can walk down any street safely, while a man who is merely feared has to watch his back every second. His origin story is not one of rage. There are no tales of him beating a rival to death with a baseball bat in a fit of youthful passion. Instead, there are stories of him organizing, calculating. As a young man, he opened a grocery store. It was a modest place smelling of soap and spices, but it was his kingdom. Standing behind the counter, wearing a clean white apron, he was the picture of the respectable merchant. He greeted customers by name. He asked about their children. He offered advice. But beneath the apron, the mind of a strategist was at work. He saw the criminal underworld not as a separate, shadowy realm, but as an extension of the market. It was just another form of supply and demand. People wanted to gamble, he could provide the numbers. People wanted to borrow money, he could provide the loans. The illegality of it was a technicality, a zoning issue. The mechanics were the same as selling olive oil. This was the genesis of his philosophy. Violence is bad for business. Violence draws the police. Violence scares the customers. Violence disrupts the flow of money. If you have to kill someone, it means you have failed to find a solution. It means you were not smart enough to make a deal. While other rising stars in the mob were building reputations as tough guys, breaking legs and making headlines, Angelo Bruno was building a reputation as a necessary man. He made himself indispensable. He connected people. He smoothed over disputes. He became the oil in the machine, the quiet force that kept the gears turning without friction. The tone of his ascent was earthy and grounded. He didn't live in a penthouse. He lived in a row home. He didn't drive a flashy Cadillac. He drove a sensible sedan. He wove himself into the fabric of South Philadelphia until he was indistinguishable from the bricks and the cobblestones. He was the man you went to when you needed a job or a loan or a problem solved. He was the grocer, in spirit if not always in fact. We watch him grow, year by year, gray hair appearing at his temples, his waistline thickening with the good food of his culture. He is patient. He understands that true power is not a sprint. It is a marathon. He waits for the hotheads to burn themselves out, for the violent men to end up in prison or in graves. He is playing a longer game. He preferred the ledger to the stiletto. He believed with a stubborn, almost naive conviction that a criminal enterprise could be run with the dignity of a corner store. He believed that if you gave people what they wanted, if you treated them fairly, if you kept your word, the system would work. And for a long time, he was right. He rose through the ranks not by climbing over bodies, but by being the man everyone could agree on, the compromise candidate, the steady hand. When the time came for him to take the crown, it wasn't a violent coup. It was a natural progression. The grocer took off his apron and put on the fedora, but the man underneath remained the same. He brought the ethos of the market to the Mafia. He brought the handshake, the nod, the quiet conversation. He brought peace. But as he stood on the sidewalk outside his store, watching the sun set over the row homes, he couldn't see the future. He couldn't see that the world of the market, the world of honor and handshakes, was fragile. He couldn't see that a new generation was rising, a generation that didn't care about groceries or dignity, a generation that just wanted to take. For now, though, he was the master of his domain, the grocer of South Philly, a man who had built an empire on the simple, radical idea that you could be a gangster and a gentleman at the same time. The 1950s in America were a time of prosperity and order, a surface-level calm that masked deep currents of change. In the underworld, however, it was an era of blood. In New York, the five families were constantly at each other's throats, a never-ending cycle of car bombs, barbershop hits, and bodies found in the trunks of cars. It was a chaotic, noisy way to do business. But 90 miles south, in the narrow streets of Philadelphia, a different kind of king was taking the throne. Angelo Bruno didn't storm the castle. He was invited in. The setting of his ascent moves away from the bustling, sunlit market stalls to the dim, wood-paneled interiors of private social clubs. These were places that smelled of old tobacco, espresso, and secrets. The windows were often painted over or covered with heavy velvet drapes, creating a permanent twilight. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that managed to sneak in, illuminating men in sharp suits speaking in hushed tones. This was Bruno's natural habitat. He was the diplomat in the shadows. While other bosses ruled by decree, barking orders and demanding fealty, Bruno ruled by consensus. He was a listener. He would sit at the head of a long table, his hands folded, his eyes attentive, letting everyone have their say. He understood that men need to feel heard before they can be led. His method of conquest was unique. He traveled. He went back to the old country, to Sicily, walking the dusty roads of his ancestors. He forged connections not just with the American mob, but with the roots of the organization itself. He understood the power of lineage. He brokered treaties between warring factions, finding the common ground of profit where others saw only the divide of vendetta. He married into the right families, weaving a web of blood and marriage that made betrayal difficult and expensive. The emotional weight of this chapter is the immense discipline of restraint. It is easy to be a wolf. It is easy to give in to anger, to strike back when insulted, to take what you want because you are strong. It is infinitely harder to be the shepherd. Imagine the psychological fortitude required to sit across from a man who has disrespected you, a man you could easily have killed, and instead offer him a deal. Imagine the strength it takes to swallow your pride for the sake of the greater good. Bruno did this time and again. He swallowed the bitter pill of compromise so that his family could eat the sweet fruit of peace. He was building a bridge. On one side were the old-school mustache Petes, the traditionalists who clung to the codes of the 19th century. On the other were the young, hungry Americans, eager for flash and cash. Bruno stood in the middle, holding the structure together with his own two hands. He connected the disparate factions of the Philadelphia underworld not with fear, but with shared profit. Make money, not headlines, he would say. It was a mantra, a prayer. Under his guidance, the Philadelphia family entered a golden age. The rackets ran smoothly. The numbers game, the loan sharking, the vending machines, it all hummed along like a well-oiled engine. There were no wars. There were no bodies in the streets. To the average citizen, the mob was a rumor, a whisper, a shadow that never touched them. The packing of this era was steady, assured, rhythmic. It mirrored Bruno's own leadership style. He was a man taming a beast. He knew that the criminal underworld is, by its nature, savage. It is populated by violent men with violent impulses. Bruno's genius was his ability to soothe those instincts, to channel that aggression into commerce. He gave his soldiers opportunities to earn, to build lives, to have families. He gave them a stake in the peace. He was the docile Don to the newspapers, but to his men he was simply the boss. And for a long time, that title commanded a respect that bordered on reverence. But there is a shadow in this golden light. We, the listeners, know what lies beneath the floorboards. We know that the peace is artificial, enforced by the threat of violence that Bruno keeps locked away in a drawer, like a gun he hopes never to use. We know that the beast can be tamed, but it can never be domesticated. It is always waiting, its teeth sharp, its hunger growing. Bruno walked a tightrope every day. He balanced the greed of New York against the ambition of his own captains. He balanced the demands of the commission against the realities of Philadelphia. He balanced the old world against the new. It was a masterful performance. For 2 decades, he made the impossible look easy. He made the abnormal look mundane. He made crime look like a legitimate business. The smoke curled up from his cigar in the quiet backroom, drifting toward the ceiling. The glasses clinked softly. The men nodded in agreement. Everything was in order. Everything was under control. It felt like it would last forever. It felt like the summer would never end. But the diplomat in the shadows knew, perhaps better than anyone, that winter is always coming. He just hoped he could keep the fire burning long enough to keep the cold at bay. South Philadelphia is not built like other places. It is a masterpiece of geometry and brick, a dense, endless tapestry of row homes that stretch out mile after mile in a rigid, unwavering grid. The houses stand shoulder to shoulder, sharing walls, sharing roofs, sharing the very air they breathe. Their stoops are scrubbed clean every morning with bleach and water, the white marble steps gleaming in the sun. Their windows watch the street like eyes, half-lidded by lace curtains, observing everything and saying nothing. It is a place of profound density. where privacy is a negotiation and secrets are shared through the thin party walls that separate one family's drama from another's. This was the capital of Angelo Bruno's empire. It was not a fortress on a hill, isolated by iron gates and armed guards. It was not a sprawling estate hidden in the countryside. It was a city of row homes, and Bruno was the king who lived right next door. He was the sovereign of Snyder Avenue, a monarch who walked the same pavement as his subjects. The structure of the Philadelphia Mafia under his reign was unique in the annals of the American underworld. It was intimate. It was domestic. In New York, the bosses were distant, mythical figures, surrounded by layers of insulation and buffers. To see a Gambino or a Genovese was a rare event, a sighting of a dark celebrity. In Philly, you could see the Don buying a newspaper at the corner stand. You could see his underboss mowing the small patch of lawn in front of his house. You could see his captains arguing with the umpire at a little league game. The organization was woven so tightly into the fabric of the neighborhood that it became invisible, not because it was hidden, but because it was everywhere. It was the background radiation of daily life. We enter the sensory world of this peculiar kingdom. It is a world preserved in amber, a nostalgic vision of an immigrant community finding its footing in America. It is a world of plastic covers on living room furniture, preserving the velvet and brocade for guests who rarely come, keeping the showroom shine for decades. It is the smell of Sunday gravy, a rich, meaty sauce simmering for hours on hundreds of stoves simultaneously, scenting the entire zip code with the heavy, comforting aroma of garlic, basil, and pork. It is the sound of church bells ringing on Sunday morning, calling the sinners and the saints alike to Mass at St. Monica's or St. Rita's, their chimes echoing off the brick facades. Angelo Bruno was the patriarch of this extended family. He was accessible in a way that seems unimaginable for a man of his power. He held court not in a palace or a fortified bunker, but at a diner table, over a cup of bitter coffee and a cheese Danish. People came to him with their problems, treating him less like a criminal overlord and more like a neighborhood magistrate. A daughter who needed a job at the garment factory. A son who had gambled too much and was in debt to the wrong people. A dispute over a fence line or a parking spot. Bruno listened. He sat there in his modest clothes, his face calm and attentive, nodding slowly as the stories unfolded. He offered solutions. Sometimes it was money, passed in a plain white envelope across the Formica table, a loan to tide a family over, a gift for a wedding. Sometimes it was just a word, spoken to the right person in the right tone, a word that could open doors or close mouths. "Go see Angelo," they would say on the street corners. "He'll fix it." His rule was defined by a strict, almost monastic modesty. He kept the membership books closed for years, keeping the family small, tight, and manageable. He enforced rigid rules against ostentation. There were no pink Cadillacs in Bruno, Philly. No diamond pinky rings the size of walnuts flashing in the sun. No flashy silk suits that screamed mobster to every cop on the beat. He wanted his men to look like plumbers, like construction workers, like union reps. He wanted them to blend in, to be part of the landscape, not an aberration from it. "If you have money," he told them time and again, his voice low and serious, "put it in the mattress. Put it in the bank. Don't put it on your back. Don't put it in your driveway." The rackets were traditional, almost quaint by modern standards. Gambling was the lifeblood, the numbers game, sports betting, the daily lottery that every housewife and factory worker played with religious devotion. Loan sharking was the safety net, the bank of last resort for those whom the legitimate banks had rejected. Vending machines, cigarette distribution, labor unions. It was a blue-collar crime syndicate for a blue-collar city. The money was steady, reliable, a river of quarters and crumpled bills. It was not explosive wealth. It was a grinder's game, earning a living one envelope at a time. The packing of this life was stable, rhythmic, comforting. It felt permanent. The seasons changed, the snow fell and melted, the heat waves came and went, but the rules remained the same. You paid your debts. You honored your word. You respected the hierarchy. You didn't ask questions. But stability, for all its comforts, can feel like a cage to the young. Beneath the surface of this domestic tranquility, a subtle tension was beginning to brew. It started as a low hum, barely audible over the church bells and the street noise, but it was there, vibrating in the floorboards. A new generation of mobsters was coming up, men like Nicky Scarfo, Salvatore Chucky Merlino, and Phil Leonetti. These were men who had not grown up in the poverty of the Depression. They had not forged their identities in the struggle for survival. They were younger, hungrier, and more reckless. They looked north to New York, where the five families were living like emperors, flaunting their wealth and power. They looked west to Las Vegas, where the mob was skimming millions from the casinos, living in suites and driving Ferraris. And then they looked at their own boss. They saw Angelo Bruno sitting in his row home on Snyder Avenue, eating his modest dinner of pasta and wine. They saw him driving a Chevrolet. They saw him preaching patience and caution. And they didn't see wisdom. They saw weakness. They saw an old man stuck in the past, a relic of a bygone era who was holding them back from their potential. Why were they scraping for pennies in the numbers racket when there were fortunes to be made in heroin? Why were they driving Buicks when they could be driving Lamborghinis? Why were they asking for permission when they could be taking what they wanted? This dissatisfaction began to thread its way through the family. It was in the glances exchanged at the back of the social clubs, eyes rolling when Bruno gave his lectures on thrift. It was in the complaints muttered under their breath when the envelopes were kicked up on Friday nights. It was in the simmering resentment of men who felt they were being denied their birthright as gangsters. Peace to a man of war feels like stagnation. It feels like boredom. Order to a man of chaos feels like oppression. It feels like a straitjacket. Bruno's modesty was his shield, the camouflage that allowed him to operate for so long without major interference. But it was also his blind spot. He assumed that his men shared his values. He assumed that they wanted safety, longevity, and the respect of their neighbors. He didn't realize that they wanted glory. He didn't realize that they were starving for action, and that his steady diet of bread and water was no longer enough to satisfy them. The row homes of South Philadelphia stood shoulder to shoulder, a unified front of brick and mortar that seemed impenetrable. But inside, the walls were getting thinner. The secrets were leaking out. The family that lived next door, the family that ran the city, was beginning to turn on itself, slowly, quietly, one jealous whisper at a time. The gentle Don sat on his stoop in the evening light, smoking his cigar, watching the neighborhood he loved. He waved to the kids playing ball in the street. He tipped his hat to the women walking home with their groceries. He felt safe. He felt loved. But he was sitting on a fault line, and deep beneath the pavement, the ground was getting ready to shift. The city of row homes was about to become a battlefield, and the domestic peace he had carefully cultivated was just a fragile facade, waiting for the first stone to be thrown. Every empire has a line that cannot be crossed, a boundary that separates order from chaos, survival from extinction. For the Roman Empire, it was the Rubicon. For the Philadelphia crime family under Angelo Bruno, it was a line drawn not in water or earth, but in morality and strategy. It was a single, absolute edict that echoed from the head of the table down to the lowest associate on the street corner. No drugs. It was a simple phrase, 2 syllables that acted as a dam against a rising ocean of white powder. But in the underworld of the 1970s, it was a commandment that carried the weight of heresy. To understand the magnitude of this prohibition, one must understand the temptation. Narcotics, heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, were the forbidden fruit of the criminal life. They were the alchemy that turned lead into gold. A kilo of heroin bought in the poppy fields of Turkey for a few $1,000s could be cut, packaged, and sold on the streets of Philadelphia for $250,000. The margins were astronomical. The profits were dizzying. It was money that didn't just pay the rent. It was money that bought islands. But Angelo Bruno looked at this mountain of cash and saw only a trap. His objection was not purely moral, though he was a man of the old school who found the trade distasteful. He viewed the peddling of addiction as a dirty business, something beneath the dignity of a man of respect. A gambler chooses to place a bet. A loan recipient chooses to borrow money. But a junkie has no choice. There is no honor in exploiting a slave. However, the true foundation of his ban was not ethics. It was survival. Bruno was a chess player in a world of checker players. He looked 5 moves ahead. He understood the legal landscape better than his own lawyers. He knew that the Federal Bureau of Investigation viewed gambling and loan sharking as nuisance crimes. If a soldier was caught running numbers, he might get 2 years in a minimum security prison. He would do his time, keep his mouth shut, and come home to a party. It was the cost of doing business. But drugs changed the equation. The government hated drugs. They feared them. And because of that fear, they passed laws with teeth. A narcotics conviction didn't carry a 2-year sentence. It carried 20 years. It carried life. And Bruno knew the frailty of the human spirit better than anyone. He knew that even the toughest soldier, when stared down by the prospect of dying in a concrete box, would break. "Drugs make rats," he would say, his voice low and grave. "You give a man a life sentence and he will sell you out to save his own skin. He will give up his mother. He will give up his boss." This was the strategic brilliance of the gentle Don. He was protecting his family from the one thing that could destroy it, the informant. He wanted to keep the temperature low. He wanted to keep the federal agents bored. He wanted to keep the organization watertight. But wisdom is a hard sell when greed is shouting in your ear. The atmosphere of the family began to darken. We move now into the minds of the younger mobsters, the captains and the soldiers who looked at the edict and saw only a leash. They looked north to New York, where the 5 families were drowning in drug money. They saw the Gambinos and the Lucases driving Ferraris, wearing Rolexes that cost more than a Philly row home, living like kings. And then they looked at their own pockets. They were grinding out a living on the margins of gambling and unions, picking up the crumbs while others feasted at the banquet. The tone shifts from the warm, communal atmosphere of the social clubs to a simmering, cold frustration. The conversations in the back rooms changed. The laughter died down, replaced by hushed complaints. "The old man is out of touch," they whispered. "He's living in the past. He's starving us." The sensory imagery of the narrative shifts here. We leave behind the smell of espresso and Sunday gravy and enter the cold, metallic reality of the drug trade creeping in at the edges. It is a world of plastic bags, of digital scales, of white powder that leaves a bitter taste in the back of the throat. It is a world of desperate eyes, the hollow, haunted gaze of the addict waiting on a street corner, shivering in the cold. The allure was too strong. The forbidden fruit was too sweet. Slowly, secretly, the ban began to erode. It didn't happen all at once. It started in the shadows, away from Bruno's watchful eye. A captain would look the other way for a fee. A soldier would move a few ounces on the side to pay off a debt. The greed began to rot the foundation of the family like termites in wood. There is a profound tension in this secrecy. These men loved Angelo Bruno. They respected him, but they loved money more. They were living a double life within a double life, criminals hiding their crimes from their own criminal boss. The fear of discovery was constant, but it was outweighed by the thrill of the cash. Bruno stood like King Canute on the shore, commanding the tide to halt. He stood firm on his principles, believing that his authority was enough to hold back the ocean. He believed that logic would prevail. He believed that his men would see the wisdom of safety over the madness of risk. But he was losing touch. He was an analog man in a digital world. He didn't understand the avarice of the modern era. He didn't understand that for men like Antonio Caponigro and Harry Ricobene, Enough was a concept that didn't exist. They didn't want safety. They wanted everything. The packing of the chapter slows down to examine this widening chasm. We see Bruno sitting in his modest office, reviewing the ledgers of the legitimate businesses, content with the slow, steady drip of income. And then we cut to a dark basement in South Philly or North Jersey, where men are counting stacks of drug money by candlelight, their eyes wide with the reflection of their own greed. They were building a fortune, yes, but they were also building a bomb. The drug trade brought a new kind of energy to the city. It brought paranoia. It brought strangers. It brought the kind of heat that Bruno had spent 20 years avoiding. The FBI started watching closer. The wiretaps multiplied. The pressure began to build in the pipes of the organization, pressure that had nowhere to go but out. Bruno's refusal to engage with narcotics was his most noble stance and his most fatal error. He was trying to save their souls, but they were only interested in filling their wallets. He was offering them a long life. They wanted a rich one, no matter how short. As the 1970s drew to a close, the gentle Don was standing on an island that was slowly sinking. The waters were rising around his ankles, cold and dark, smelling of chemicals and betrayal. He thought he was the captain of the ship, steering it through calm waters. He didn't realize that the crew had already mutinied in their hearts, seducing themselves with the poison he had forbidden. The fruit had been bitten, the garden was tainted, and the expulsion was coming not from God but from the very men he called his sons. Geography is destiny. For decades, Atlantic City was a decaying relic of the Victorian era, a ghost town of peeling paint, empty boardwalks, and memories of a glory that had faded with the roaring 20s. It was the lung block of the Philadelphia mob's territory, a place where old gangsters went to retire, to inhale the salt air and die quietly. It was worthless. It was a graveyard by the sea. And then, in 1976, the laws of man changed the laws of economics. The state of New Jersey legalized casino gambling. Overnight, the graveyard became a gold mine. The narrative shifts now from the claustrophobic brick canyons of South Philadelphia to the open, windswept expanses of the Jersey shore. The air here smells different. It smells of the Atlantic Ocean, of brine and seaweed, but also of something new, diesel fumes. The roar of the waves was drowned out by the roar of construction equipment. Pile drivers pounded the sand. Cranes swung across the sky. The skeletons of steel and concrete began to rise from the dunes, promising a neon future that would rival Las Vegas. Atlantic City was Philadelphia's backyard. By the ancient laws of the underworld, it belonged to Angelo Bruno. The vending machines, the construction contracts, the labor unions, the service industries that would feed the casino beast. It was all his for the taking. It was the greatest windfall in the history of the American Mafia. But gold does strange things to men. It makes them crazy. It makes them frantic. The tone of the story shifts from the simmering frustration of the drug trade to a feverish, high-stakes greed. The sharks were in the water. The scent of money drifted north on the ocean breeze, reaching the nostrils of the 5 families in New York. They looked at Atlantic City and they didn't see boundaries. They saw a buffet. They reasoned that Philly was too small, too provincial, too weak to handle an operation of this magnitude. They wanted in. This created a pressure cooker for Angelo Bruno. He was standing on top of a volcano of wealth, and everyone wanted to push him in. His underlings, men like Antonio Caponigro, known as Tony Bananas, rubbed their hands together. They saw Atlantic City as their birthright. They wanted to build a wall around the boardwalk and tax anyone who tried to cross it. They wanted to fight for every inch of sand. "This is ours," they whispered. "We bled for this territory. Why should we share?" But Angelo Bruno was not a man of war. He was a diplomat. He looked at the map and saw the reality. The Philadelphia family was small, maybe 50 made men. The Genovese and Gambino families in New York had hundreds of soldiers. If he tried to hoarding Atlantic City, it would mean war. A real war. A war that would bring bodies to the boardwalk and heat from the feds that would melt the casinos before they even opened. So he did what he always did. He chose peace. He chose compromise. We share, he decreed. There is enough for everyone. We let New York eat. We let them operate. We take our piece, they take theirs, and nobody gets hurt. It was a decision born of wisdom, of a long-view strategy that valued survival over dominance. But to his captains, it felt like betrayal. It felt like cowardice. Imagine the atmosphere in the back room of a construction trailer on the Atlantic City shoreline. The air is thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of wet concrete. Tony Bananas sits there, listening to Bruno's orders. His face is a mask of obedience, but his eyes are burning. He is looking at a pie worth billions, and his boss is telling him to cut slices for strangers. The packing of the narrative accelerates here, reflecting the gold rush mentality. Deals are being made in seconds that used to take months. Suitcases of cash are moving up and down the expressways. The old rules of protocol are being trampled in the stampede for wealth. Bruno tried to manage this explosion with his old-world tools. He held sit-downs. He brokered treaties. He preached the gospel of enough. But he was speaking a language that no one wanted to hear anymore. In the face of infinite possibility, enough sounds like an insult. The loyalty of his captains began to erode, washed away by the promise of millions just as the tide washes away a sandcastle. They looked at Bruno and saw an obstacle. They saw a man who was giving away their inheritance. They began to wonder if the gentle Don had lost his nerve. Had the years of peace made him soft? Was he afraid of New York? Atlantic City was supposed to be the crowning jewel of Bruno's reign. Instead, it became the poison pill. It introduced a level of greed that the old structure could not contain. It brought the sharks right to the shoreline, and when they looked at the water, they didn't just see the casinos. They saw blood. The neon lights of the resort's international casino flickered on for the first time in 1978, casting a blinding, artificial glow over the boardwalk. It was a beacon of a new era, but in the shadows of that light, the knives were being sharpened. The boardwalk empire was rising, but the emperor was losing his grip on the throne. Bruno stood on the beach looking out at the gray, churning Atlantic. He had kept the peace for 20 years. He had kept his family safe. But as the wind whipped his coat around him, he must have felt the chill of the coming storm. He had invited the wolves to dinner, hopping to satiate them. He didn't realize that once they finished the meal, they would look at the host and realize he was made of meat too. Conspiracies are never born in daylight. They form in the margins, in spaces where voices are lowered and names are never spoken twice. In the back seat of a parked car, windows fogged from breath and cigarette smoke, Antonio Caponigro listens more than he speaks. The city hums beyond the glass, unaware that loyalties are being rearranged inside this narrow, dim enclosure. Words move carefully here, wrapped in implication. No one says murder. No one says betrayal. They speak instead of balance, of opportunity, of a future that could be cleaner, richer, quieter. Tony Bananas has always understood patience. He knows that power does not announce itself, it whispers. The men around him speak of Atlantic City as if it were already theirs. They describe numbers softly, almost reverently. Construction contracts, casinos rising from sand, cash flowing like a tide that never recedes. All of it, they say, is being held back by one man who refuses to see the world as it has become. Angelo Bruno, the gentle Don. A relic, they imply, clinging to an old code while fortunes wait to be claimed. The Genovese emissaries never raise their voices. They do not need to. Their confidence fills the silence between sentences. They frame betrayal as correction, not rebellion. If Bruno were gone, they suggest, nothing would collapse. The streets would stay calm. Business would continue. Only the profits would change hands. They speak as though history itself is asking for this adjustment, and all Caponigro must do is listen carefully enough to hear it. As these whispers spread, Angelo Bruno moves through his days unaware of the shape forming around him. He sits in familiar rooms, accepts familiar greetings, still believing in the ancient language of respect. Handshakes linger. Conversations begin with courtesy. He trusts what he can see, and what he has always seen is loyalty maintained through restraint. Violence, to him, has always been a last resort, a failure of imagination. He believes that diplomacy, once established, sustains itself. But something has shifted. The air around him feels thinner. Jokes end too quickly. Laughter no longer reaches the eyes. Men who once sought his counsel now speak in shorter sentences, their glances drifting away before thoughts are finished. The absence is subtle but constant. Trust does not vanish loudly. It erodes, grain by grain, until the foundation is hollow. The tragedy unfolding is not one of rage, but of miscalculation. Bruno cannot imagine that the very principles he championed could be turned against him. He built his power on negotiation, on keeping blood from the streets, on believing that reason could always prevail. The New York families understand this intimately. They use his patience as leverage. His refusal to dominate becomes evidence of weakness. His calm becomes an opening. Caponegro feels the pull of it all late at night, alone with his thoughts. The promise is intoxicating. To step out of the shadow, to claim territory long denied, to finally be seen not as a servant but as a ruler. The men guiding him know this hunger well. They feed it slowly, carefully, never pushing, always inviting. Ambition, after all, blooms best when it feels self-chosen. Meetings continue in unfinished buildings, among exposed beams and the smell of damp concrete. Cars idle on darkened streets, engines running softly, ready to move if needed. Each conversation tightens the circle around Bruno, though he remains at its center unaware. The silence around him grows heavier, more deliberate. Loyalty becomes performative, something displayed rather than felt. In Shakespearean fashion, the old lion remains proud, dignified, convinced that the order he built will hold. He does not see the jackals gathering because they bow too deeply, smile too politely. By the time the whispers have fully formed into intent, the outcome is already decided. Power has shifted without a blow being struck. The tragedy is sealed not with violence, but with words spoken softly in the dark. What makes the conspiracy so effective is its invisibility. There are no sudden breaks, no dramatic confrontations. Everything changes gradually, politely. Invitations arrive later than they used to. Decisions are made elsewhere and presented as conclusions rather than discussions. Bruno senses distance but interprets it as age, as the natural slowing of time. He has survived decades by reading danger accurately, yet this danger wears the mask of civility. The men around him justify their silence by telling themselves that nothing is certain yet. Doubt becomes a shelter. If no one speaks openly, no one has betrayed anyone. Caponegro understands this psychology instinctively. He tells himself he is merely listening, merely considering possibilities offered by powerful friends. Responsibility is postponed, blurred, shared. In this fog, morality loses its edges. New York strategists remain patient. They know that the most effective coups feel inevitable by the time they are acknowledged. They let greed do the work that force once did. Atlantic City glows in their descriptions, a city of lights and endless nights, just close enough to touch. The captains imagine their names etched into that future. Compared to this vision, Bruno's caution feels like an insult. And so the circle tightens further. Each man assumes another will speak, will warn, will hesitate. No one does. The whispers have done their work. The gentle Don sits at the center of a web spun from his own values, believing still in the sanctity of the handshake, unaware that hands are already being withdrawn. The dark listens quietly as the final silences fall into place. In this stillness, fate no longer rushes. It waits. The city breathes unchanged while decisions settle like dust. When the moment finally comes, it will feel sudden only to one man. For everyone else, the ending has already been rehearsed, line by line in darkness. There will be no warning, only recognition, arriving too late to alter what ambition and silence have already decided. History records the sound of this moment as quiet. March 21, 1980 arrives without ceremony. The day does not announce itself as significant. Morning light settles gently over South Philadelphia, pale and indifferent, touching brick facades and quiet streets the same way it always has. Angelo Bruno wakes, dresses, moves through familiar motions shaped by decades of routine. There is no sense of urgency in him. If anything, there is comfort in repetition. The world, at least on its surface, still feels predictable. By evening, Cosa's Little Italy restaurant glows warmly against the dark. Inside, the air is thick with steam and sound. Plates clatter softly. Glasses chime. The smell of slow-cooked gravy hangs heavy, rich with garlic and tomato clinging to coats and hair. This is a place of comfort, a place that feels insulated from consequence. Bruno has eaten here many times. The chairs know his weight. The walls have absorbed his voice. He sits at the table like a man among friends. His posture is relaxed, unguarded. Wine is poured, dark and generous, its surface catching the low light. Bread is broken, crust warm beneath his fingers. Conversation flows easily, skirting carefully around nothing and everything at once. There are stories, observations, small complaints. No one speaks of tension. No one names the fracture that has been growing quietly between courses. Bruno listens more than he talks. He nods, smiles faintly, lifts his glass at the appropriate moments. If he feels the strain beneath the surface, he gives it no shape. He has always believed that storms pass if they are not challenged directly. Silence to him has long been a form of control. The men around him mirror his calm, their faces composed, their voices steady. If eyes linger too long or drift away too quickly, it is subtle enough to be dismissed. The food arrives in heavy portions, familiar and reassuring. Sauce coats pasta thickly, steam rising as forks turn slowly through it. Bruno eats with appetite, savoring the flavors. The wine warms his chest. The bread softens in his mouth. There is pleasure here, simple and grounding. It feels almost defiant in its normalcy. Outside, night presses closer, but inside, time seems suspended. Yet beneath the warmth, something feels final, though no one acknowledges it. This is a meal shaped by restraint. Every word is chosen. Every laugh is measured. The underworld has always borrowed its rituals from older stories, and this one carries the quiet weight of betrayal disguised as fellowship. Like Judas at the table, those complicit share food and drink, their loyalty already transferred elsewhere. Bruno senses, perhaps distantly, that the room is smaller than it once was. The trust he built over years sits fragile now, held together by habit rather than conviction. Still, he believes in the endurance of the old ways. He believes that shared meals mean something. That respect, once earned, does not evaporate overnight. He does not imagine that the warmth surrounding him is borrowed, temporary, already receding. The packing of the evening slows. Plates are cleared, glasses emptied and refilled. There is no rush to leave. Lingering feels important, as if staying seated might delay whatever waits beyond the door. Bruno adjusts in his chair, comfortable, unarmed by suspicion. The restaurant hums softly around him, unaware that it is hosting a farewell. Eventually, the moment arrives because it must. Chairs scrape back gently. Coats are reached for. The air shifts. Bruno stands, smoothing his jacket, moving with the ease of a man who has done this countless times. He exchanges brief words, nods, touches a shoulder. Nothing dramatic, nothing overt. Just endings disguised as transitions. The door opens and the warmth spills out into the night. Cold air rushes in, sharp and bracing, carrying the scent of damp pavement and early spring. Bruno pauses for a fraction of a second, coat pulled tighter, collar lifted. Behind him, the restaurant remains bright, alive, unchanged. Ahead of him, the street waits, darker, quieter. He steps forward. The light falls away almost immediately, replaced by shadow. The sounds of Cosa's Little Italy fade behind him, replaced by the distant hum of traffic and the hollow echo of footsteps. The warmth of wine and food lingers briefly, then gives way to the chill. This is the crossing, though he does not name it as such. The tragedy of the moment lies not in fear, but in trust. Bruno does not flee. He does not hesitate. He believes until the last step in the sanctity of what he has built. The old way of life walks beside him, invisible but heavy, carrying codes and handshakes and promises that no longer protect him. As he moves into the night, the city does not react. Windows remain dark. Cars pass without slowing. History does not announce itself when it happens. It simply records the transition from light to shadow. March air closes around him, cool and final, as Angelo Bruno leaves the table one last time, carrying with him the quiet end of an era. The car idles on Snyder Avenue, its engine humming softly, almost apologetically. Inside, time slows to a crawl. Cigarette smoke hangs in the air, curling lazily toward the ceiling, blurring the edges of the windshield. Angelo Bruno sits quietly in the passenger seat, his body relaxed, his presence unassuming. Beside him, John Stanfa grips the steering wheel loosely, eyes forward, posture casual. The street outside is unremarkable, a familiar stretch of asphalt bordered by darkened storefronts and sleeping row houses. Nothing about the moment announces its significance. The city breathes normally. A distant car passes. Somewhere a radio plays faintly through an open window. This is how endings often arrive, wrapped in ordinary sounds camouflaged by routine. Bruno does not speak. He does not sense danger pressing in. The evening has been uneventful, the meal satisfying, the conversation polite. Whatever tensions lingered earlier have faded into the background, filed away as problems for another day. The smoke thickens slightly as Stanfa exhales, the smell sharp and familiar. Bruno's cigar has gone quiet now, resting between his fingers. The interior of the car feels enclosed, insulated as though the outside world has been temporarily sealed off. It is a small, intimate space, one that has carried countless conversations, decisions, compromises. Tonight, it holds silence. Then something shifts. A figure steps out from the darkness, emerging not suddenly but deliberately as if summoned by the stillness itself. The movement is subtle enough that it almost blends into the night. There is no rush, no hesitation, just approach. The shape grows clearer, resolving into intention. Time seems to hesitate, stretching thin, giving the moment a strange clarity. The sound that follows does not belong to the street. It is not part of the city's usual language. The shotgun blast tears through the quiet with a force that feels elemental, a violent punctuation that cannot be taken back. Glass explodes outward, fragments flashing briefly in the streetlight before falling uselessly to the pavement. The air inside the car is instantly transformed, filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder, sharp and invasive, colliding with the fatting sweetness of tobacco. There is no struggle, no exchange. Peace does not argue with violence. It is simply broken. The echo lingers longer than the sound itself, ringing in the ears, flattening everything that comes after it. For a moment, the world feels hollow, emptied of texture. The car rocks slightly, then settles. Smoke drifts, thicker now, carrying with it the finality of what has occurred. Angelo Bruno's body slumps, the architecture of decades collapsing into stillness. The gentle Don, who governed through restraint and negotiation, is undone in an instant by a weapon built for annihilation. The aftermath stretches on, suspended. Stanfa remains in the driver's seat, frozen, the steering wheel still warm beneath his hands. The street does not react immediately. It takes time for reality to reassert itself, for the shockwave to move outward. Somewhere nearby, a door opens. A voice murmurs. Tires roll past without slowing. The city absorbs the moment reluctantly, as if unsure what it has just witnessed. This is not merely an assassination. It is a rupture. The sound of that blast travels far beyond Snyder Avenue, echoing through boardrooms, social clubs, and whispered conversations. It announces with brutal clarity that an era has ended. The careful balance Bruno maintained, the blood he held back through patience and diplomacy, has been released. What he restrained for decades now waits eagerly to surge forward. The sensory fragments linger stubbornly. Shards of glass glitter on the seat. The smell of gunpowder clings to fabric and skin. The ringing silence feels heavier than the noise that preceded it. There is something deeply unsettling about how quickly peace is erased, how fragile it proves to be when confronted directly. Bruno's philosophy dies with him, exposed as vulnerable in a world that has grown tired of restraint. In the days that follow, men will talk about this moment in hushed tones. They will replay it, analyze it, assign blame and credit. But in this frozen instant, none of that exists yet. There is only the car, the body, and the street that witnessed it all without judgment. The city has crossed a threshold it cannot uncross. The golden age of the Philadelphia mob does not end with a speech or a declaration. It ends with shattered glass and smoke hanging in the air. It ends quietly, despite the violence, because endings often do. The noise announces the change, but the silence afterward confirms it. The rules have been rewritten, not with words but with force. Angelo Bruno remains slumped in the seat, his expression unreadable, his authority gone but his presence still heavy. He was the architect of peace in a world that mistook calm for weakness. His death is not celebrated by the street. It is absorbed, processed, and then used. Power shifts quickly when restraint is removed. The dam has broken. What follows will not resemble what came before. Alliances will fracture openly now. Grievances will no longer be deferred. Violence, once controlled and strategic, will spill freely, justified by ambition and fear. The city will feel it in ways it has not for years. On Snyder Avenue, the car remains where it is, an unremarkable vehicle turned into a historical marker. The night resumes slowly, cautiously, as if unsure whether it is allowed to continue. The smoke dissipates. The ringing fades. But the consequences have already begun their long expansion outward. This is the moment when balance is lost, when diplomacy is answered decisively with force, when the tools of war silence the voice of restraint. The shotgun blast does not just end a life. It signals the beginning of a flood that will reshape everything Bruno worked to keep contained. History will remember this sound as the point of no return. After Angelo Bruno dies, the city does not pause to mourn. It lurches forward unbalanced, as if a stabilizing weight has been suddenly removed. The silence he cultivated collapses quickly, replaced by noise, confusion, and fear. Power, once carefully rationed, becomes something to be seized openly. Men who once waited now rush. The streets feel different almost immediately, sharper, more alert, as though the city itself senses that restraint is no longer required. The first shockwave comes with fire. Phil Testa, known quietly and ironically as the Chicken Man, inherits a throne already cracked. His reign is brief, tense, uncertain. On a spring morning, an explosion tears through his home, the force violent enough to be felt beyond the block. Windows shatter, walls buckle, smoke and debris fill the air. Testa is killed not in a meeting, not on the street, but at home, where power was once meant to rest safely. The message is unmistakable. There are no safe places anymore. Philadelphia begins to feel like a battlefield without uniforms. Row houses that once stood as symbols of stability now seem fragile, their thin walls offering little protection against what might come next. Conversations grow quieter. Curtains stay drawn longer. People listen more closely to footsteps outside, to engines idling too long. Fear becomes ambient, settling into daily life like dust. From this chaos rises Nicky Scarfo, a man whose presence feels fundamentally different from those who came before him. Where Bruno governed through patience, Scarfo rules through obsession. His violence is not strategic in the old sense. It is compulsive, theatrical, meant to dominate not just rivals but the atmosphere itself. He does not negotiate. He eliminates. The body count climbs, and with it, the sense that something irreparable has been unleashed. The city absorbs each killing with diminishing surprise. Headlines blur together. Names repeat. Violence becomes routine, stripped of meaning beyond its immediate utility. This is the nightmare Bruno spent his life preventing. A world where fear replaces order, where loyalty is enforced through terror rather than trust. The underworld, once governed like a business, now resembles a fever. Sensory details mark the transformation. Sirens cut through nights more often. The smell of smoke, exhaust, and gunpowder seems permanent. Social clubs feel tense, conversations clipped, laughter rare. Men sit with their backs to walls instinctively. The old rituals persist, but they feel hollow, like traditions performed out of habit rather than belief. Looking back, Bruno's years appear almost unreal. Quiet profits, few headlines, violence contained, purposeful, restrained. His philosophy was not gentle out of kindness, but out of calculation. He understood that chaos consumes everyone eventually, including those who believe they control it. His reign was a long act of resistance against the natural tendency of power to self-destruct. Without him, that resistance collapses. The wolves he held at bay turn inward, feeding on one another. Each act of violence justifies the next. Authority no longer rests on reputation alone. It must be demonstrated constantly, loudly, publicly. Scarfo thrives in this environment. The city does not belong to him, but it fears him, and fear proves easier to maintain than respect. Row homes once again frame the story, but now they feel different. Their stoops are empty, their windows dark. They stand as witnesses to a city that has lost its balance. Where Bruno once walked calmly, believing in continuity, others now hurry, scanning shadows. Trust is gone, replaced by calculation. The legacy of the gentle Don becomes clearer only in absence. He was not perfect. He was not benevolent, but he was deliberate. He believed that power, if exercised quietly, could endure. His silence was not weakness. It was structure. And when it was shattered, everything rushed to fill the void. In the end, his story offers a grim lesson about power itself. Peace in the underworld is not the natural state. It is an anomaly, something cultivated carefully against overwhelming pressure. It requires patience, restraint, and a willingness to be misunderstood. The gardener who tends that fragile order is never loved. He is tolerated, envied, and eventually resented. And inevitably, he is devoured by the very wolves he feeds. As the era of Scarfo unfolds, the violence grows louder, more erratic, more visible. The city becomes a warning rather than a model. What Bruno held together through silence collapses under noise. His absence proves that sometimes the most powerful force is the one that never announces itself. The story fades back to quiet imagery. Rain falling on empty streets, water pooling along curbs, a city breathing uneasily in the dark. There is no final speech, no moral delivered outright. Only the understanding that the calm Bruno created was the thin barrier between order and madness. When that silence died with him, the darkness did not need to be invited in. It was already waiting.